We're joined now by former Secretary of State, our senior counsel for global affairs, Mike Pompeo. And Secretary Pompeo, I want to go right to this. Last week, we discussed the threat of these Chinese companies. It's starting to make more and more news buying up land in the U.S. near U.S. military bases. CNN now has new reporting out about the proximity of Huawei equipment on cell phone towers in the Midwest, specifically to some of our most heightened assets like our ICBM locations, intercontinental ballistic missile locations in the Midwest. Some of this equipment, Secretary Pompeo, is still up and running. Now, I kind of like you to explain for people when the U.S. government says that this equipment can capture and disrupt highly restrictive DoD communications, including those used by U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees nuclear. What exactly does that mean?
Jordan, what the Chinese Communist Party has been working on is to put their conducting semiconductors, their equipment, their receivers, their transistors, all the tools that they need to both listen to communications from American military installations here, right inside the United States, in places like Kansas, North Dakota, Colorado, to be able to listen to those communications, and then when the moment is right, to not only have captured that data, but be able to either block those transmissions or to use the information which they've learned to their military advantage. We're dumb to have allowed this to happen. It was hopelessly naive to say, well, this was cheap technology. Let's put it on our cell phone towers. It was cheap, right? It was inexpensive. Whoever bought it, they got it for nearly free. But remember, if it's free as the customer, they're figuring out how to generate something for it. And what they're generating is their own national security, and they're putting ours at risk. And we ought to make sure that there's no Chinese equipment on any cell tower in the United States, most importantly, in places where we have military assets, military installations to protect our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, and our most important national security secrets as well.
You tweeted, Mike, they're inside the gate. Huawei equals Chinese spies. Ban Huawei and take this threat seriously. Now, your policies as Secretary of State were aggressive in combating Chinese espionage, including shutting down that Houston consulate. Have the Chinese made gains now under this administration? Because they don't seem to be taking the threat seriously.
Jay, the language the administration has used has been good. Their efforts have been subpar. They haven't been sufficient. The only thing the Chinese understand is real action, real power, right? You can talk about closing a consulate, but until you do it, there's no impact. And I couldn't tell you precisely how much gain they have made, but I am confident the Chinese Communist Party doesn't believe the Biden administration has the same aggressiveness, the same focus, the same edge that we had for our 4 years. This matters to every American all across. I use this term inside the gates very intentionally because it is all around us right here. We think about China and we think about long places away, but the truth of the matter is it's in our neighborhoods, it's in our schools, it's on our military installations, it's in our universities and research institutions. It is around us, and the Biden administration has to take the real steps to push this back. It is hard. We began this in the Trump administration during my time. There's an awful lot of work that remains to be done. We didn't get it finished either. We need to continue down this path. This shouldn't be partisan. This should be about America.
You know, it's interesting because I remember early on when you first joined us, we started talking about the Chinese had infiltrated the university systems and private and public universities. They got their people internships at the United States Congress with members of Congress. And so their aggressiveness in this is very serious.
And very organized and very deep and huge. It's hard to grasp, right? When you have a country that has 4.5 times the population of the United States, this is a big operation, and they are deep and thoughtful and strategic, whether that's at the university system level or research institutions, or even just coming to school board meetings inside the United States just to be there and make friends. It's an effort. It's a propaganda effort. They call it the Chinese United Front Department, UFD. This organization has real intentions to change the way Americans live, and we can fix it. It is not destiny, but it takes political leadership and will and focus and leaders of courage at every level, from the president to county commissioners and school board members.
We know local governments are important, Secretary Pompeo, but there is legislation right now. I think this is important to point out. I saw your tweet over the weekend, and I wanted to kind of reinforce this because it's unusual right now in Washington to have bipartisan legislation. I think it's getting Republican support There's some Republicans concerned about the amount of money being spent, but it's the CHIPS Act. And you tweeted, I urge members of Congress to pass the CHIPS Act. The cost of compromise on this bill pales in comparison to the cost we will suffer if we allow the Chinese Communist Party to one day own and control access to our most critical technologies. This legislation has to do with everything from the chips in our phones to the chips in F-35s, but it's about bringing that manufacturing back to the United States. Why on this issue should the American people be willing to compromise with the Democrats? Because, I get it, but I think that people need to understand.
No, Jordan, it's the right question. Look, there's been a lot of stuff hung on to this piece of legislation. It's called the CHIPS Act, and I think everyone could see that this was really important, was likely to pass, and so they threw some stuff on there that you and I would stare at and say that is not helpful and productive. We ought to go try and push as much of that off, and then tomorrow, after we pass the CHIPS Act, we ought to try and get rid of it. But for the moment, we have this window of opportunity. We no longer make the most sophisticated semiconductors that matter. They matter for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Now, I was a soldier once. I drove an M1 tank. Today, many of those vehicles have Chinese technology in them. You can be sure that when push comes to shove, that technology won't work for us when it matters the most. We should pass this. We should onshore this technology. We've talked about supply chains an awful lot. The CHIPS Act will provide the incentives so that there'll be big semiconductor wafer manufacturing technology back in the United States in places like Ohio and Texas and Arizona. There are already companies prepared to come build and to train Americans to build back. This is the center of American manufacturing and technology. The CHIPS Act is the right step at the right time, and I hope we'll get every Democrat and every Republican to say we should step forward and do this, and we should do it right now. It's on the Senate floor today. It'll probably be on the House floor, the floor of the House later this week. I hope everyone will say this is the right thing for American national security, and we'll get after it.
Yeah, it is not just about our cell phones. It is not just about our cars. I mean, Secretary Pompeo said F-35s, tanks, and then you're reliant on them to keep those systems operating.
I mean, the danger.
The Chinese, who can then just press the off button whenever they want.
Well, this is the great risk that we take as a country with continued dependence upon China. And I was thinking back, Mike, to during your administration and your time as Secretary of State and your time as CIA director. These kind of bold moves were met with aggressive opposition. In fact, they oftentimes didn't make these bold moves because they knew the response was going to be so overwhelming. So I go back to the issue of, what should the administration now be doing? It was good that the FBI caught the situation in the National Arboretum where they were going to, the Chinese government was spend $100 million for this so-called beautiful garden, but the pagoda happened to be at the same height that was necessary to gather intelligence information in the 2 miles from the Capitol. And so that's what concerns me here is they're being very aggressive and very creative.
I am laughing here only because, it's no coincidence that they're at the same level. This was intentional, and it's going to take I regret that Justice Department got rid of a program that we had begun with to go after Chinese spies, Chinese folks conducting espionage, Chinese conducting efforts against the United States. If Americans put our kids' lives at risk in the generations that follow, it's going to take aggressive, sharp action, smart leadership to get it right. We need to get semiconductors back. We've all seen that, Speaker Pelosi said she was going to go to Taiwan, and the Chinese say, well, we don't want her to come, and all of a sudden Biden will. I must say that if you're the Australians, South Koreans, the Japanese, or Americans, you can't do that. You can't fold in the face of mere threats. The Chinese understand power and strength and transparency, and we don't need to provoke them. We just need to defend the things that matter most here in the United States. And I don't know if you all saw the story. There was an espionage agent inside the New York Police Department that they found. They've now indicted him. These are the kinds of things that we're seeing at the local and state level that will matter an awful lot. And so it's going to take real leadership from Washington, D.C., the Justice Department, the FBI, the President of the United States to push back against this threat. And you got to bring the technology back. We can't be importing all this stuff that Chinese just dump on us and then get installed in our systems, and we spread them throughout America so the Chinese can hear every single thing we're saying or track our kids on TikTok. This stuff is all connected, Jay, and truly a threat to the way we live our lives here in America.
Secretary Mike Pompeo, of course, Senior Counsel for Global Affairs for the ACLJ. Thanks, as always, Mike, for your insights on this.